When you write an academic book review, the first thing you want to do is make sure that your formatting is appropriate. And there are certain standards in the field which don't vary too much. So typically we start with a citation of the book. We want to make sure that we give some bibliographic information. And as part of that citation, what's a little bit different here is that we tend to give also the page numbers, the total page numbers in the book. I'm not sure if that's meant to indicate if it's worthwhile to read this, if it's too short or too long, but some readers find that quite useful. When you give the page numbers, one thing you can also do is you can give some account of how many pages there are before official pagination starts. So if you were to write, let's say, PP, that stands for pages, and then let's say in Roman numerals XI, which would be 11, and then 328, then that would mean that there are 11 sort of uncounted pages before we get to page 328. Or if, let's say, the preface has Roman numerals, that's another way to indicate that. After that, after the pagination, we get to the price, and I would suggest that you just check a major retailer in whatever is appropriate for you. Or you could look for the recommended retail price that the publisher typically puts on a book. There's also the ISBN number, and the ISBN number, fairly standard, is sort of associated with the book, and it allows people to find the book quite easily. Then we have the reviewer's information, which usually consists of a name, an email address, and sometimes a university affiliation. And after that, you can start your proper review. Now, this review is quite a good review, it seems to me. I'm not an expert in this field, but it seems like quite a good review, and I thought I would use it as an example. You can find it online if you go to the Medieval Review, which you can Google, and that's quite a good site also to look for other sample academic reviews. Now, as we move to the actual review, so the rest of this, a typical academic review has a fairly formal, organized structure, and it really consists of 3 parts. The first part, the introduction, can span any number of paragraphs. In this case, we have kind of 2 introductory paragraphs. It takes the writer a little bit to get going, but that's totally fine, as academic book reviews often tend to be a little bit longer than your average review. Now, this kind of introduction is going to do 3 things. So when you write your intro, you need to do 3 things. The first thing is to give some context. We'll just put a C here for context. And context can mean any number of things. It can mean talking about other people in the field who have written studies and what their opinions are, what books are out there already on this topic. It can also mean talking about today's issues and whether this book fits in with those, whether people are concerned about those issues. You can start with a quotation that sort of captures the question that we're dealing with. So there are lots of different options. And in this case, what you can see is that this book is about King John, and it's about the Magna Carta. And as a result, this reviewer is quite clever in saying, well, let's think about how we are remembering these 2 events or persons today. And right now it's the 900th anniversary. Does anybody care about King John? Do we care about the Magna Carta? And then what have other scholars said about these particular historical things? So there's quite a bit of context here before we actually get to the actual book, and that's totally fine. You don't have to mention the book right away. We know it's coming. And then when we get to the book, we get to the author's thesis. So I'm just going to abbreviate this as the author's thesis. You need to state what the main argument is of the book that you are reviewing. Okay? And in this case, we read, in this new synthetic biography, Stephen D. Church resists explicit revisionism of historiography of either Magna Carta or of the king himself, and instead blah, 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 blah. It seems quite complicated, but if you're in the field, then you probably know what that means. And that's another thing to notice, is that reviews tend to be very specialized. They often assume that you know something about this topic already, that you're not going to read this unless you have some prior interest. Okay? So you are always going to write a review for really 2 audiences. Keep in mind that you have 2 audiences. You have a general audience of people who are scholars and might just pick up this book because it sounds interesting and they'd like to know what this book is about. That's your one audience. And then your other audience is really these specialized readers. And you need to talk to both of these audiences, but it's quite all right to be fairly specific and assume a certain amount of knowledge about the period. Then the last thing that you need to do in your introduction is you need to give your opinion. So we'll just abbreviate this as OP. We need context, we need the author's thesis, and we need to know what you think. This particular reviewer takes a while to get to this. You can see that in the second paragraph, we finally see some value judgments. This is a successful study, right? It is refreshingly non-teleological, whatever that means. Those are the value judgments that we need to get. You can't just summarize what the book is about. You need to have an opinion about whether it's worth reading it. And then we get to the middle paragraphs. And the middle paragraphs, you can have as many of these as you like. I've just shown you a couple of snippets from this sample review. But most of these middle paragraphs are going to follow a fairly detailed structure, and there are sort of three common approaches that you'll come across. One is just to follow the same order of chapters and sections as in the original book. So you could just follow the same order of chapters and discuss one or two chapters per paragraph and then critique them as necessary. Another way to organize things is by topic. In other words, if you find that the original book is really focused on a number of themes or topics, then you can sort of organize your paragraphs effectively in the same way as well. And then another way to do it is kind of criticism-based. And what I mean by that is that if you have, let's say, 6 or 7 things you really want to say about this book, then you can have a paragraph about each. But I hesitate to recommend this last method because it can lead to a very choppy review. If you have, one point and then you jump over to something else and then you go somewhere else and so on, the reader is going to be a little bit annoyed and it's going to have a hard time understanding the bigger picture or the one thing that ties everything together. That's why I would suggest that no matter what kind of criticism or method of critique you pick, and there are many of these, always come back to the main argument of the author. Always make sure that that is front and center. Sure, you can have a paragraph that talks a little bit about external things like, the cover art or typos and so on. But the main thing, the main line all the way through should be the main argument. So instead of thinking of these dots going all over the place, think of like a main road. That's the main argument you're describing. And then as you do that, you can have little digressions, talking about some of these other points and other sites along the way. Always be detailed. So if you look at these examples, you can see that it doesn't take long for the reviewer to jump to specific points, right? The reviewer is not speaking in general, but is backing everything up with details from the text. So always be detailed. And remember that you are an expert in the field. Even if you don't feel like it, the reader is trusting you to be an expert in the field. Now, don't be a show-off, but try to be a guide. Try to hold the reader by the hand and kind of say, well, I know more about the field than just this book that I've just read. I know a lot more, and I'm going to share how this book fits in, how it's meant for you, right? In this particular review, the reviewer is talking about what kind of audience this is for. But as you do that, again, always come back to that main argument and what you think of it. And then the last little bit here is your conclusion. Now in this case we have one paragraph that really does most of the concluding, and there's some other paragraphs in between here obviously that I have sort of skipped. In this case the paragraph is quite positive, and I would suggest that you think about doing something similar. Even if you have some criticisms, it's typically best to end on a positive note. But don't lie, right? If the book really sucks, you got to say that. So on the whole, try to be positive, but be honest as well. Notice the little reference here to Casablanca, the movie. You can be a little bit more popular, a little bit more interesting, and in a review like this, it doesn't have to be stuffy, it doesn't have to be boring. So it's up to you how you want to frame it. But on the other hand, you don't have to be super creative and have all sorts of hooks and interesting lines. The main thing is really to explain to the reader, what kind of a book is this? Is it worth your time to read it? And how does it fit in with the state of research at this particular point? So hopefully that helps you to write an effective academic book review.